Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. Welcome. Today is Wednesday, March 3rd, 2021-ish. It's been almost a year since we started doing these InfoMullet Ask Me Anythings. It actually started in late February, believe it or not. It was a Friday night, and there had just been a military incident where Turkish troops were attacked in Syria, and I went on Facebook Live, did a Friday night Ask Me Anything on Syria about Russia, Turkey, and then I did the Saturday night. I did the very next Saturday night. It was a Friday and Saturday night combo that actually started the Ask Me Anythings, and I thought in February of last year that conflict between Turkey, Russia, and Syria would be like the news of the year. Like, that was a big deal. There was a conventional state conflict between three modern actors. Here we are a year later, and it's like, not that bad, all things considered. So what we're doing today, one of the things that I started with, we jumped with the Ask Me Anything directly into the pandemic, and we were already in, the presidential election campaign already started. We were already in the primaries, so we kind of just ran headlong into, the bare knuckles description of the emergencies we had going on, the election going on, all those topics. But I've gotten a lot of requests over time, like, I need help understanding what the heck we're talking about, because when it comes to context on complex events, when it comes to domestic policy, there's often a lot of people throwing stools at each other, but no one really sits back and breaks down, how do these things work? What do these economic concepts mean? What do these civics concept mean? So what I'm doing today with a little bit, since we do have today is the domestic focus, is we're actually going to be focusing on a series of topics that build to a discussion about the current minimum wage debate. Now, that's obviously a hot news. It's going into Congress. It's what was part of the stimulus relief bill. Now reconciliation's canceled it. We can talk about that. But there's a lot of concepts that underlie these debates on things like minimum wages and what should Congress do at the federal, or should it be a state level? And so with some of these domestic episodes, while we'll no longer, on the brink of insurrection itself, we will take a step back and discuss these while still going through current events and trying to get it and build up what you'd call it a mullet civics education. Those of you who've been following me for years know I love talking about domestic issues. So, what is common for me about how the Senate works in detail, or what's going on economically that builds up to these, some people that might be review for some people, in which case feel free to add, contribute, ask questions if you want to go deeper. For some, it might be the first time they've heard it, and so it might be useful. So today we're going to go over a couple topics that build along a theme, and the first is the media literacy. Like, there's always this confusion between Wall Street and the economy. Then we're going to do a little bit of mullet civics and discuss the difference between fiscal policy and monetary policy, and this is all building to somewhere. I'm kind of going along a theme here. Then we're going to talk about economic federalism, which is the concept of a single sovereign policy in the US across a variety of regional economies. Give you a case study of one of those monetary policies in effect, quantitative easing, which has been in place off and on going back since the financial collapse of 2009. And then that's all leading to, these are sort of underlying things that help understand the discussion of minimum wage and federal minimum wage, and what is the right level of minimum wage and how we should think about it, which is really where we're going to hopefully end up. And then I will do a bit of touch on current events, because Governor Cuomo is getting his ass kicked in New York, rightfully so apparently, and we'll cover that as well. So as always with these, if you have questions, add them throughout, and we'll go through this. We'll pause. Feel free to bring up other things we can dovetail into other. If you haven't yet, like and follow the InfoMullet. Maybe share this out on the video for people who want to watch it. Or if you want to consider supporting us, Bonky and myself, and what we do, check us out at www.patreon.com/InfoMullet. I finally saved up. I'll be getting a new microphone so I can get rid of this little headphone. I'll be getting a nice fancy microphone. Hopefully that'll improve the sound quality. We're also working on some soundproofing and stuff like that. So all your support is needed to make these videos better, make them crisper, get some more effects in here. And so we greatly appreciate all the mulleteer supports, and I gave a shout out to them earlier today. And mulleteer is only $5 a month, senior mulleteer $10 a month. We even have a Medici mulleteer. Whatever level you're at, we really appreciate it. It really helps us out and makes this possible. So let's go through some hellos to folks and a happy birthday. Good to see Laura. Mike, you had to log off. When you get back, this will be on YouTube. Check it out. Allison, good to see you. Ishmael, Jay, I've been requested to do a happy birthday to Charles for his 50th birthday. So happy birthday, Charles. We won't do the singing, dancing thing that you get in the restaurants, but you do get a shout out. And so as always with these info mullets, these Ask Me Anythings, it's a Wednesday today, first Wednesday of the month, domestic issues. That's what we're going to go over here starting. We'll put this full episode up on YouTube on Friday. So if you missed something or you want to go back and check, you can get it on Friday. We'll add the individual segments over the next week by no later than next Friday. And then the second Wednesday, or excuse me, the third Wednesday of the month is always foreign affairs and COVID-19. And we got a lot of foreign affairs stuff going on. We did a mega mullet review of what's going on in Russia, Iraq, the Myanmar coup, India, Bangladesh, Turkey. All of these foreign affairs are important, and we'll get to them in the third Wednesday of the month. So again, first Wednesday, we're going to focus more on U.S. domestic issues, get a little bit deeper in the policy, and then third Wednesday, we'll go back to COVID-19 updates and foreign affairs. Also, coming up here in March, we're going to start hitting the one-year anniversary of some forecasts I made about COVID-19 and how it would play out. We're going to be reviewing those beginning on the next one. So stay tuned for the next Wednesday one. That'll be Wednesday the 17th, I believe. So let's dive into it with starting off. The first thing, quick media literacy. Wall Street versus the economy. This is something that I hear people get confused all about, and it's just important that we can distinguish these, because a lot of people, they'll argue about the value that Wall Street's at, or the S&P 500 or the NASDAQ, or what a stock exchange is. They may have gotten interested because of GameStop or something like that recently, and they're mistaking that for the economy. So let's define these terms. Wall Street is best understood, and I'm using Mark Cuban's definition here. I'm borrowing from Mark Cuban. He describes Wall Street as a digital store of value. Now, 20 years ago, someone might say, if you buy a share of a company, you get a little bit of control of that company, you get influence on that company, you're kind of getting a piece of ownership. It's not really how it's treated anymore. These shares are traded as digital stores of value. You can think of them in a way like a cryptocurrency. You know, a Bitcoin has whatever value people give to it. Same with a piece of digital art or a non-fungible token or anything like that. So think about Wall Street as not being at all connected to the economy. Wall Street is only the current value of these little slips of digital paper and what people value them at. If they like Facebook, or they like Apple, or they like GameStop, they're going to bid that up or lower it. And, you know, there's different cycles and risk levels and all those things like that. But Wall Street itself is not a reflection of the economy. This is very important to get away from it. And people from both sides, on the red and the blue, they have this bad habit. It started, or I first started noticing it under President Obama's term, where liberals and progressives would say, hey, our guy's great. Look, the stock market's going up. And I'm like, no, that's not how it works. And I'm going to go through today some of the reasons why that's not the case. But also, then when the stock market was going under Trump, those people got quiet, and Trump supporters said, hey, look, our guy's going great. So the Wall Street is not connected to the economy only but tangentially. It's far more a reflection of what people value these little bits of digital paper and these share prices. Now, obviously, the economy has an influence on Wall Street, but you should never mistake the value of Wall Street as the health of the economy. And that gets in when we talk about minimum wage throughout this episode, as we're building up to that, to get to that point. Just because Wall Street is doing well, should be surprised to no one, doesn't mean jackwagon to do with the rest of the economy, what people are getting paid, what the cost of living is, all those things. Wall Street is a side player in that. And also, presidents have very little to do with the value of Wall Street, because it's simply what these digital pieces of paper have and what people value them at. Now, what a president does have control over, and what I want to get into next, is a little bit of civics. And we're going to call it Mullet civics, because I got to tag Mullet on everything. But right, what's fiscal and monetary policy? This is something that, you know, so we know that Wall Street isn't the economy, and we know the economy is the entire scope of all transactions, exchanges, commercials, value, you know, all that stuff, the big economy. But what control does the president have on the economy? Well, the president, along with Congress, set something called fiscal policy. And fiscal policy has to do with the budget. And this is going on right now in Congress, because we have the stimulus relief bill, which has to do with how much are you getting for unemployment, how long it lasts. Likewise, the president is submitting his budget. These are issues of fiscal policy. alongside that is monetary policy. And people know, if people know a little about Wall Street and less about the economy and a little about fiscal, they almost always know nothing about monetary policy unless they've studied it, which is why I wanted to get into this really in depth about fiscal versus monetary policy. But let's take a step back and take a look. Well, let's answer some questions here. Stock market metric is probably the worst metric for measuring the healthy economy. John, I agree. Laura, doesn't Wall Street have a significant effect on the economy? Question mark. For example, when stock market is way down, banks are less willing to loan money, which the actual economy needs, buying homes, business loans, etc. That's actually what we're going to get into. I would say, Laura, that monetary policy has more to do with the ability and willingness of banks to loan and the confidence in the economy. Now, most banks, when they're deciding whether they're going to do loans, they're not going to look at a GameStop blip or something that's going on in a bubble or something like that on Wall Street. They're going to look at the confidence of the economy and where they see the economy going. They're going to look at unemployment. They're going to look at income to real estate ratios. They're going to look at the interest rates and where money's going. And we're going to touch on that with monetary policy, because that's one of those things that people think is, hey, if Wall Street's doing well, then the banks think we're doing well and they will issue more money. But a lot of it has to do with monetary policy more than it does with the Wall Street value. Someone asking me not to start a Mullet OnlyFans. I may have an OnlyFans for my model porn, my simulation research, where I use simulation models and I describe it as model porn, but that's a different subscription entirely and not appropriate for Bonky. So what is fiscal policy? Let's start with that. So if you aren't familiar, the US government budget, and this is one reason you can tell that the president doesn't have the influence on the economy that partisans often think they do. We often think that the president's term, like Biden just started his presidential term. He is inaugurated on January 20th. He's getting his nominations in, right? He controls the economy. Well, the trick is the federal fiscal year runs from end of September or beginning of October through the end of September. So we're already in fiscal year 21. It was 2020 previously before the New Year's, but we were still in fiscal year 2021. And that fiscal year is reacting to the budget that was submitted by President Trump last year. So until the end of this fiscal year in September, we are operating on President Trump's budget. Not only are we operating on President Trump's budget, but most of the budgeting that happens is done in 2 or 5 year cycles. It's 2 years for the DoD because of a constitutional provision. It's 5 years for the rest of the federal government. So when they submit a budget for the 2020 federal budget, it is forecasting the spending for the next 5 years. Now, every year there's a budgeting cycle, and I want to show you what that looks like because it's coming up here right now. Right, and I apologize, the graphic's a little fuzzy. The link for this is that I actually got it from a science group, but it basically shows that in February, the president's budget is released. Now, don't think that the president has built this budget in the last 2 weeks. Even though it's released in February, this budget has been being constructed in some cases for years. I've worked on the DoD side of this. They have a system called PEBS. That budget literally is a 4-year effort to get it to submit today. The budget that's being submitted last month, just as we ended here in February, the president's budget for 2021, calendar year 2021, it's for fiscal year 2022. They started planning that in fiscal year 2019 and 2020. So that is, these budgets are years in the making, and 90% of what you see is built by executive agencies that are going through and evaluating what the requirements are from the law, what capabilities they need, and the other 10% is what Congress argues over. So keep in mind that, and this is why the transition was important. President Biden, when he was president-elect on November, 8th or so that they made the call, from that point forward, he should have been getting briefings because his first budget is really built on top of a lot of what he inherited from President Trump's effort going back over the past 4 years. And they only had a short window to change anything they wanted to change before it gets submitted here in February. Now, recently, presidents have often delayed the submission of the budget till later. That they do that for reasons. They're supposed to submit it in February. But then from April through September, the House and Senate annual resolutions, there's 5 or 6 discretionary funds or big spending bills. They do what's called appropriation. They mark the bills up, they pass them. And in theory, they should all pass by September 30th. I'm telling you right now, it almost never happens. There's always at least one bill that passes that deadline. And this is when you hear about partial shutdowns of government and something called a CR, continuing resolution. A CR is a passage by the Congress that says we're going to hold everything as it was in the previous year for a month, 60 days, give us some more time to pass. And you'll see that we've been using these CRs now going back multiple administrations for a little bit of extra time. If a CR runs out or Congress decides not to issue a CR, you get a partial government shutdown. But so the budget actually begins. If Biden submits his budget, let's say he submitted it on time in February, which he didn't, but let's say he did, and let's say Congress passes it between now and April and September, which they won't, but let's say they do. Biden's first budget that he controls is going to start October of 2021, calendar year. That's going to be fiscal year 2022. So when we think about what does the president have control over, Biden's real influence from a controlling standpoint at a budgetary level begins October of next year. Now, obviously, Congress can throw in spending bills at any time, especially in emergency, and that's where you see this COVID-19 stimulus relief bill coming. And that's not a regular budget item. It's an emergency spending measure. So you can say there is going to be some influence of that, and that's why these elections matter. But we will probably be seeing the fullness of Biden's budgetary policies by fiscal year 2022 when they submit the budget for fiscal year 2023, and that's going to be next February. So keep in mind these massive delays that go on and these are all fiscal policies. Now, as I said, fiscal policy, it determines just about everything you think about in the government, but monetary policy is not controlled by the federal government. Monetary policy is controlled by the Federal Reserve, and this is a very key different thing to understand when we talk about Mullet civics and what drives the economy. So the economy is driven by confidence, obviously, and all those things you'd expect, how people are doing. It's also driven by budget, policy, things like that. Fiscal policy has an influence, but monetary policy has a huge influence, and that is determined by an independent group called the Federal Reserve. Presidents can appoint and nominate people to the Federal Reserve, but they are politically independent. The central bank is independent. And the job of the Federal Reserve has two mandates. One is to ensure full employment. The other is to ensure low inflation. Those are contradictory mandates, so they do the best they can. But since the collapse of 2009, the Federal Reserve has been ever more engaged in sort of helping the economy. And there's a lot of things that can be done in a monetary policy standpoint that are tools that the Fed has, which influences this economy, this big E economy, which may or may not be related to Wall Street. So the Federal Reserve can change the overnight lending rate between banks. They can change the benchmark rate. And this is the rate which filters through and becomes the rate of lending for the economy. That's the most common tool they've had in their arsenal to use. And you'll, even going back to Federal Chairman Greenspan and Bernanke, you would watch these cycles as if you think about it, it's kind of a dial. As your interest rate to lending goes up, that introduces friction in the supply of money and the value for which people need to get for their investments, and that causes caution, concern, and pulling back. So a monetary policy can be expansionary or contractionary, and it has to do with where this interest rate is being set. If you're an expansionary policy, you want low interest rates because that encourages people to go out and invest the money and be more, you can do more things with it. You don't have to be as cautious because you're not borrowing. It's cheaper to borrow the money. If you want a contractionary policy, you increase the interest rates. Now, traditionally, going back into the 1990s and the 2000s and the aughts and through the financial collapse, we would adjust that interest rate would be the primary means by which the Federal Reserve helps or hinders the U.S. market. If it sees that we're going into a collapse, the 2001 stock market collapse after 9/11 and because of 2000 dot-com bubble, you saw Chairman Greenspan reduce that interest rate. They dropped the interest rate to very low. Well, the interest rate can only go to zero. So the interest rate went low. We got a bubble that formed because you no longer get the return on those interest rates. So you go seeking, that's kind of by design. It went into the real estate. The real estate market inflated. We began increasing interest rates again. That introduced friction on the economy. And then it got exposed that all these real estate loans were garbage and no good and things like that. We all know what happened in the 2009 collapse. So the problem was the interest rate was not very high at that point. There wasn't a lot of room to give left. And when your main tool is adjusting interest rate, if you get to 0% interest rate, you can't go any lower. You're out of that tool. Your options are very limited. And that leads to the main tool I want to talk about, which is quantitative easing. And quantitative easing was something that the Federal Reserve began in light of the financial collapse. And this is a very different tool than the overnight interest rate and the benchmark rate. Quantitative easing is where the Jan is asking, can the interest rate go below zero? I think you saw a negative interest rate. So take a quick step. What is an interest rate trying to do? An interest rate, if you think about it like you have a chunk of money, and let's say that money is worth 10 gold coins, right? So the gold coins are going to stay static. Let's assume they stay static. And you have a chunk of currency that's worth 10 gold coins. That currency, fiat currency, has a tendency to inflate. And inflation over time, let's say there's a 3% inflation. That means that it will take more dollars to equal that 10 gold coins in the future. The interest rate is designed to bridge that. It's really designed for most long-term investments. The interest rate is designed to keep inflation, to basically be a hedge against inflation. Now, on top of that is risk. If you are a risky activity, the interest rate has a premium and related for risk. But at its core, interest rates are designed to basically coordinate time and this inflationary thing. So when a negative interest rate means that when you account for inflation over time, the real interest rate is negative. It means that the interest rate is so low, it's not even keeping up with what's expected to be the core inflation, which is often, it's been very low recently, but it's often 2 to 3%. So if you have an interest rate that's only 1% and you estimate the inflation is going to be at 3%, your real interest rate is negative 2%. And you can think of this as a tool as to how you get, if you're a policymaker in the Federal Reserve or any of these central banks and you want people to stimulate the economy, you want them to move their money into more productive areas, you want to move them out of the more cautious savings and lower interest, because the lower the interest rate, the safer the vehicle is, the less it's going to probably do with the economy. And this gets right into quantitative easing. So if you think about the types of interest rates you can invest in, the most secure, the most safe, the most stable are U.S. Treasury bonds. The government of the U.S. would have to default, which sometimes we wonder, but is generally considered the rarest thing that could possibly happen in the current economic and fiscal environment, right? It's the reserve currency of the world. It's one of the strongest economies. You know, I'm not going to say never because the world's weird, but generally the U.S. corporate debt is considered the most secure and safe. These treasury bills, and they have the lowest interest rates. So it's only a few percentage points. So people who are averse to losing their money may park it in a government bond. And during a recession or a downturn, that means that money's not going in the economy to stimulate things. That's how you get a recession. That's how you create a depression. That's how you get a fiscal shock. A credit recession is when people take their money out of other investments. Now, as you go up from treasury bonds, you get into high security corporate bonds. Those have a higher rate of returns. You get into municipal bonds, which can go bankrupt. So those are a little bit higher premium. Then you get into things like assets like real estate, stocks, other commodities, metals, rare commodities. All of these things have higher return rates because they are more risky than a U.S. government bond. So what quantitative easing did is it took effectively the U.S. government bond off the table as the most secure investment you could have. And it did that by the Federal Reserve basically saying, as the U.S. government issues debt, we will assume the debt by expanding our balance sheet. Like if I want to buy U.S. government debt, I got to plunk money down. I'll get a little bond. It says mature in this many years. I can put it in a shoebox. Yeah. It's all great. That's a traditional way. But the way the Fed buys government debt in something called quantitative easing is they just go on the Excel sheet and say, we bought $110 billion of U.S. debt in this month. We're going to expand the money supply that we control by 110 billion, add a few zeros, boom, easy done. And it's kind of a clever move. I mean, if people thought shorting stocks was weird, this quantitative easing is much weirder, but it is much more important to understand for the everyday of how the big economy functions. Because what quantitative easing does is it takes that really secure investment off the table. With the Fed buying government bonds at effectively 0% interest, you have to be willing to take a negative interest rate if you want to buy that same bond. It's basically pushing everyone out of government bonds, and now they've got to go seeking return in riskier types of assets. And so And this is by design. The design of quantitative easing is to get money out of the safe havens and get it back circulating. It's borrowing from the Keynesian point of view that the boom and bust cycles are driven by these animal spirits that when people are scared, they're going to retreat to a safe haven. If everyone stops investing their money, the monetary cycles of the economy seize up and you need to get that money moving again. So you want to push people into riskier stuff, and that's what quantitative easing is supposed to do. Side tangent, Hayek, opposing view. I will do a Keynes versus Hayek so I can bring in the best two rap songs of economic history. But Hayek's view is the opposite. Hayek's view is that it is the lowering of interest rates by these central banks that creates the false perception of value and gets people chasing returns. We won't get into that too much, but simply understand for now, when quantitative easing was put in place after the financial collapse, it created this ripple effect. And this is very important for the discussion of minimum wage. Well, how is this important? Well, when you can invest in corporate bond or government bonds to get your return, you're going to go seeking return in riskier things. And what that does is that causes bubbles to inflate and prices to raise faster than they might otherwise, because the money you would put in corporate bonds or safe savings investments, CDs, market funds, you can't put them there anymore because you're not getting returns. So you go into riskier things. And this is, I mentioned, real estate. The real estate bubble in the US is in some part, not entirely, but in some part, a reflection of quantitative easing. The stock market, the bull stock market that has been going now for, and this is where monetary policy can affect Wall Street and the economy separately. When people can't put money in government bonds, they put them in corporate stock bonds, or they put them in corporate stocks, and they do that digital store of value, like Mark Cuban was saying. This leads to an increase in the bull market, this massive bull market we've been on, and this drives inequality. One of the reasons that we're talking about minimum wage is the inequality perception of the perceived inequality that's going on between how much the wealthy are getting and how much the rest of everyone is getting, and how that plays out. And it can play out in two ways, one of which is who owns what share of the wealth is kind of an abstracted but important. And in that case, after quantitative easing, they saw about like 40 or 50% of the gains that came from stock markets and things like that, and quantitative easing went to the top 5%. So here is an engine of inequality, but that's kind of by design, because you want the richest people to put all their money in stuff that's going to stimulate the economy, and if it does well, they reap the benefits. So that was by design. But another way that we feel inequality is much more tangible, which is that, hey, my wages no longer pay for the things that I need to survive: my housing, my food, my education, my cost of goods, all these things. Now, this is not to say that there aren't a whole lot of other factors. This is very simplified. But when quantitative easing causes bubble in real estate markets, and we'll show this in a second, it can raise the price of real estate to the point where the wages you are getting in many regions are no longer sufficient to pay for where you need to live. And this is getting to the core of this minimum wage debate. Yep. And Jan's pointing out there are many countries right now with negative interest rates because many countries are doing similar things with that the US is doing. I'm focusing on the US right now because we've got this debate on the minimum wage, but all of this ties together. So one of the concepts that this plays into, again, a very basic concept that I apologize if it's review for anyone, but this concept of economic federalism in the US is very, very unique among a lot of countries in that we have a sovereign federal government based in DC. It's the Congress, the president, and the Supreme Court. It's the federal government, three branches of government. You know, you learn it and a bill becomes a law. But then we have these semi-autonomous states that have the power to set their own economic agendas. They have their own budgets, they have their own laws. The way that states are using in the federal system in the US is very unusual with other countries that have a federal and then maybe a local. They have no intermediate state. Some do in the federal. But because the US is so large, covers so many different geographical regions, and has these different states, what you end up having is you could almost in some ways say that the economies of each of these states individually is like an economy in the world, except we're all under this one sovereign federal thing. And I want to share an example of what that looks like to show what I'm getting to here. This map is kind of cool. It's the US states renamed by their GDP in million, by what country their size, $2017. So I'm gonna try and keep a eye out on the dates, because the years of the data goes on. But this just shows that, you know, Washington State, where I grew up, that economy is the same size as Iran. California, it's always been known that's one of the top 5 economies in the world. If California was its own economy, it'd be the United Kingdom. It might actually be better than the United Kingdom now after Brexit and what's going on there. Texas is, for those of you who live in Canada that might be listening in, you're Texas. Congratulations. I don't know if that's what you woke up today wanting to be, is Texas is like Canada or Canada like Texas, but effectively the state of Texas has a GDP equal to the entire GDP of Canada. And you can see all these nation states here in equivalence. And this is important because when we talk about monetary policy on foreign affairs, the value of your currency between states determines your economy to a large degree. If you trade between 2 states, the United States and China, right? If you're exporting goods, you want a weak dollar. If you're importing goods, you want a strong dollar, because it bases on how much you may. So if I'm buying Chinese goods to import, I have to pay for that in Chinese currency. When I do that, the demand on Chinese currency goes up. Their yuan, the unit of currency, the yuan or the renminbi, strengthens relative to the dollar, and their goods become incrementally more expensive. This is the basis of that trade deficit. Remember, a trade deficit is just an accounting variable that takes the amount of goods we exported minus the amount of goods we imported, and that's it. It's not a high score that you win. It's the same as me going into KFC. I give them $20. I leave with a bucket of chicken. The trade deficit between me and KFC is now $20 to KFC, but I have my chicken, right? So that's important to remember, these trade deficits. But if you want to improve your economy, you can manipulate your currency through legal and illegal means to make it more or less expensive relative to other things. This is where economic federalism gets really important. All of these states have very, very different economies, but they are tied together with one currency. This is a problem similar to the European Union. The European Union, if you remember a few years ago, Greece was having a lot of problems with its debt and the cost it was taking to insure the debt. And it was getting, had to get bailouts, and there was a lot of discussion. The Greek economy is very, very different from the German economy. Those are 2 very different regions, 2 very different historical and cultural areas, but they are tied together in a single currency of the euro. And everyone was talking about how if Greece broke away, it would deflate its currency to make its exports cheaper, and therefore more people would buy them and it'd help its economy. But because it's tied in the European Union, it couldn't do that. Same problem in the United States with economic federalism. We don't think about it because for us, this was set 200 years ago, right? This was determined, and it was, if there was any question, it was settled by the Civil War. We're one union, right? These are just states, but the same concept is at work. These different powered economies are not able to individually inflate or deflate their currencies as they trade with other economies in this United States. And this creates a wide divergence in how these you think about cost of living, like purchasing power parity. How much does it cost you to get eggs, bacon, and you know, a healthy breakfast of some eggs and bacon and hash browns in Cambridge is a lot more than it is in Atlanta, and a whole heck of a lot more than it is in West Virginia. Yet it's the same eggs, bacon, and hash browns, and that is the equivalent of the purchasing power parity and this cost of living difference. So we see the cost of living difference here. This is now kind of related to that economy, right? If 100 is the average cost of living, it's the index of cost is the average, right? And you can see here these light yellow ones. These are where the 100, let's see, Minnesota is about average. I think Minnesota's close. Minnesota and Florida are the 2 closest ones I can see. These are the index, right? So these are in the middle. As you go into darker shades, especially these oranges and these reds, you get higher cost of livings. What this is saying is if your hash brown, eggs, and bacon cost $5 in Minnesota, it might cost $6 or $7 in Washington, and it might cost close to $9 or $10 in California, right? It's showing you that the same goods cost a lot more because of this effect of the regional economy variation and this concept of purchasing power parity, disparity between areas. Now, this gets in back to the minimum wage, right? If you have a federal minimum wage across this entire country, it's going to matter a lot whether you're living on that minimum wage in a low-cost place like West Virginia's 92, Indiana's 89, Kansas 86, right? I think that's the lowest I can find. 86. 86 is a lot lower than if you're living in California at 142, New York at 146, right? The cost of living, the amount that money is going to go is a lot different, and from where you're able to get it elsewhere. Laura's pointing out good. So, we're going back to some questions. Someone was the Swedes. I don't know which state was the Swede. I missed which state of the Swedes. I think I just blanked Sweden out of my mind. So I don't know which state was the Swede. Someone tell me in the comments and we can pick at them. Trisha's pointing out Alabama is Venezuela. That's hilarious. You don't want socialism, do you? Yeah, don't even get me started on how the Republican Party is now the Chavistas. But Laura's pointing out a good question here. While states have different costs of living, there's also a large disparity between rural and urban cost of living with states. This is an excellent point. This is fractal segmentation at its finest. What the hell is fractal segmentation? Well, that's where you begin looking at finer and finer, smaller areas of measure when you're studying a problem. And if you study the US economy at the size of a country, you get one number. We have this much GDP, and this is what our average thing is. But if you break it up in 50 states, you now have 50 different numbers. If you break those states up into counties or metropolitan areas, you begin getting variation. And this is what fractal segmentation is. It means getting ever finer units of measure, which better define your problem to that local area. Now, I use fractal segmentation when looking at homicides and violence. And in fact, if you ever want to hear more than enough on fractal segmentation, up on the Info Mullet channel, I got an hour video long called the Coastline of Violence. It's using fractal segmentation to understand homicides in the US. But it goes from basically saying the nationwide average of homicides is about 5.7 per 100,000. But that's a nationwide. And if you go to states, some states are at 2, others are at 13. And then I went to counties, and then I go to cities, and then I go to neighborhoods in cities, and then I go to blocks in cities, and then I go down to even streets in city. Because yes, we have that data. There are some streets in the US that are 600 homicides per 100,000 in that very small area. Now that's a small area, but that's a very different problem than 2 homicides per 100,000 out in the country somewhere. And this is what fractal segmentation does, is it allows you to understand at greater detail these things. And it isn't just operating in violence, it's also operating in these economic questions. Georgia, Sweden, ain't that the best? Derek saying Georgia was Sweden. So, the Georgia governor and Anders Tengel, that's a match made in heaven. They both have the same approach to coronavirus, which is to pretend it doesn't exist. So, I'll post a link. People are asking about the Coastline of Violence. It's actually up on the Info Mullet channel. I'll post a link in here. If you go up to the Info Mullet channel on YouTube, which is youtube.com/c/theinfomullet, there's a link down below for that. Just go on there and type in Coastline, or if you type in Coastline of Violence Info Mullet in Google, it'll probably come up. Anyways, that's what fractal segmentation is. And you can use that analysis to understand these economic situations, which is kind of what I'm building to here. And you guys are so smart, you're jumping ahead, which is great. I love this group. So this quantitative easing, right, when it went rolling across this country, just like the purchasing power is different and the economy is different, it splashed in different areas, and it concentrated from a real estate standpoint in certain coastal cities, right? And certain boom towns, Austin in Texas, and certain other ones where the real estate went way up and the businesses seemed to go way up and the cost of living went way up, but the minimum wage did not go up. And that's the problem with the federal minimum wage that is now being addressed. But yep. Valeria has a great example of the difference in segmentation. The temperature of a city overall is very different than the temperature of an individual house in the city that is on fire. That's good. The average temperature last night may have been X degrees, but if your house was on fire, it's a lot hotter, and it's really important to understand that difference. Yeah, John's about studying measure theory. It's actually based off the Coastline of Britain problem, John, if you want to go back to fractals and math, but it's based off that. So let's tie all this together. What the hell are we talking about here? We're talking about Wall Street versus the economy. We're talking about how the economy, the president can control fiscal policy, but doesn't necessarily have control of monetary policy. Monetary policy sets these different rates when you're importing and exporting, and within the country, it does quantitative easing. And quantitative easing basically inflates asset bubbles, one of which is real estate. That increases cost of living, and it doesn't apply equally, so it creates disparate cost of living, which results us in the minimum wage debate. See, that's why we need to get some of these basic concepts out, these intermediate things, so we can talk about the real policies policies that matter. And by the way, I am looking forward to policy discussions that don't involve like insurrection. Like, I am really looking forward to policy discussions that have some shades of nuance them as opposed to what's been happening in the last 4 years. It may not be, I'm not saying this is a bright new day, and in fact, I'm really looking forward to beating the tar out of Biden on policy debates, but I'm just looking forward for a different kind of policy discussion going forward. So the policy discussion on the minimum wage, what I want to do is give you the one chart that will help you cut through all of this stuff about minimum wage, and the effects gets so lost. There's so many studies, and there's so many people saying it's good in these cases or it's bad in these cases, or, you know, first of all, let's go some of the effects. Some of the things that can happen when you adjust the minimum wage that people are concerned about is it's going to raise unemployment. That's a common one. Or it's not going to raise unemployment. It's going to shift the makeup of the labor market at that minimum wage. You may have less young people who are unskilled, more skilled people go in. You can talk about elasticity of prices. Certain businesses may go out of business if they can't adjust. All of these effects are argued about ad nauseum with all these studies, but I'm going to tell you there's one chart that, if you look at this chart, will help you understand why all these different positions can be simultaneously held and how to cut through all that with one chart. Now, if I was selling this, it'd be like, you know, click here to get the one chart. But this chart, I hope, and it's something called the Kaitz index, or the, I hope I just pronounced that right. I realized I didn't look up the pronunciations. K-A-I-T-Z, the Kaitz index. And that's the name of today's episode. Kaitz, Buy Me Love, little homage to the Beatles. But the Kaitz index is a very useful index for understanding the minimum wage relative to the median regional wage. So let's go take a step back. The minimum wage, whether it's federal, state, or local, because there are now some city level minimum wages, is a lawful floor on the wage. And there's three types. There's a covered minimum wage, a tipped minimum wage, and then a waived minimum wage, often for farm and agriculture. We're going to talk about just the main top line number, the minimum wage. We're not going to get into the other two, but this concept also applies. But the Kaitz index takes that lawful minimum wage, that floor of minimum wage, and it divides it into the median hourly wage of a region or a geographic area. Now, median is not the same as average. It's very important. Average is simply you take all the numbers and you divide them by the number you did and you get an average. Averages are very susceptible for things like inequalities, that you can skew a number higher because you have some people making a load of money. Median is the midpoint, right? Median is the exact where you're going to find that midpoint intersection, and that's where you're going to want to say half make more and half make less. So you divide the minimum wage into the median hourly wage, and what you get is a percent. And over time, they have found that this percent, it's a nonlinear curve, identifies whether you're going to have more negative effects than positive effects, or more benefits than you will negatives. And this is the chart I want to share with you right now. So drum roll, please. There we go. Long drum roll as I move this here. Here we go. This is the Kaitz index, right? This is the impacts of the minimum wage as a percent of the median wage of an area. Now, this area is usually done as a regional because economists are very specific. Economists rarely measure anything at the federal level anymore. They're measuring it down, to Laura's point, at county or city levels, right? So over here to clear the chart, 0 to 100%. If you are at 100%, that means your minimum wage is the same as the median hourly wage of the region. If you're at 0%, well, then you don't have a minimum wage. And what this shows is, if you were able to plot all the studies of, like, you know, and I'm not going to say every single one, but a majority of the studies that have been done on unemployment effects, and you were to plot them somewhere along this based on where that median wage fall, you would find that at 55%, if the minimum wage is 55% or lower of that median regional wage, then the benefits exceed the negatives. Now, I'm not going to swear for everything, but for the most part, that means you don't get as much unemployment as you might fear. There's less loss of jobs. The negative impacts, the benefits that you get for raising that minimum wage, are higher than the negatives. And that's, you know, and I'll show you where this evidence comes from in a second. If you're in this 55 to 65%, that's mixed. And at 65% or higher, that's where the negatives exceed the benefits. And this is why you can have people with good intent both looking at peer-reviewed solid studies say two completely opposite things. If you're proposing a minimum wage that is in this red area, it will probably have more negative effects than benefits. But if you're proposing a minimum wage that's in this area, the blue area, it's going to have more benefits than negatives. And this is why you can argue this until the cows come home, and no one ever brings this up, even though this actually rationalizes why one study says it's negative and the other says it's positive. They were looking at different Kaitz indexes. And this is something that you can find these in all sorts of papers. And I got a whole slew of papers in the links here. If you go looking for Kaitz index, you'll find it everywhere, but it's rarely talked about in the general discussion or policy. And that's unfortunate, because it is extremely useful for understanding where to place these effects. And so this is now the US as a Kaitz index, right? You can look across the world. They use this all over the world now. This is the OECD, and again, it's 2011. You can see the minimum wage to median, or the minimum wage to median wage ratio in 2011, how many countries in the OECD. And again, so this is now the Kaitz index, and this is a frequency. And so you can kind of see there's a distribution curve here where the US was a little bit lower than 40%. And it was, you know, the highest, most frequent one, the mode here is right around 45%. And you can see there's not a lot of them that get above 60%, and there's one that's in 70%. And that's that effect of, as you get higher above 65%, the negative effects tend to outweigh the benefits of it. So where are we at from a federal standpoint? What's the history of the Kaitz index? This is the debate now. Everyone's going to talk to you about the minimum wage as to its real value, its inflation adjusted value, its dollars, whether it's changed or not. That's useful, but those dollars don't tell you the story of what's going to happen when that wage changes. The Kaitz index gives you that information. Like if I tell you you get to choose between having a minimum wage at $10, $12, or $15 an hour, you don't know what that's going to do unless you know the median regional wage and then the percentage, and that gives you the guidance of whether it's a good idea or not on average. So how do they find this out? It's kind of funny. Economists, this is where Laura was talking about counties and borders. Economists are crazy. Like, they get into data more than I do. This is a map of the United States. It's a map of the United States where there are counties that have different minimum wage because of the state, but have cities that overlap a state border. And so this is, this weird pattern here is actually along the borders of states that have different minimum wages, where a city splits across, and they use these as controls. They do experiments, because you can basically see this county now straddles two different minimum wages, and you can do a nice controlled experiment. Same county, same city, but it splits across. And so the purple ones here are, they have no minimum wage differential. So, you know, Texas here just uses the federal minimum wage. So does Oklahoma, I think. No difference here. But as Texas moves into New Mexico and Arizona into Nevada and California, these states have different minimum wages. So when you have a town or municipality crossing the border, it becomes an excellent test bed for economists to come in and do all their little experiments. So this is where they're getting the data from most of these studies, where they gauge the effectiveness of this, because they can take two different minimum wages and a relatively all else being equal and do a comparison. This is a map of every study. So every dot on here is actually an economics piece of paper. And I'd like to say I read them all, but that's absolutely not true. What it shows, however, is that the 90% of all economic studies fall in this green space, which means they're only studying Kaitz effects between 30% and this 55%. So when people say the overwhelming amount of studies show negligible or no negative effects, that's because the overwhelming amount of studies fall within a range where there's not negative effects. As you get in these studies that go in higher, that's where the negative effects occur. And as you get in studies lower, they have much higher benefits. But this is showing simply that 90%, and this was done in 2015, it's a meta-analysis, but literally hundreds of economic studies, 90% of those studies fell into this range between 35 and 55%. So again, where are we at historically? What's the US historical range? Well, this is the historical Kaitz index for the minimum wage. So again, to clear the chart, on the left is the Kaitz index. It goes from 0 to 100%. Again, this is the percentage of the minimum wage to the median regional wage. And this is now just at the region here is the United States, right? So the three zones are identified: blue, yellow, red. But this line here, this heavy blue line, this is the historical Kaitz ratio going from 1980 all the way to 2020, which is, we ended here. And you can see here that when the minimum wage started, it was a little higher right on the top of that, and then it dropped over time, and it began, and this is why you need to periodically or regularly, annually, adjust your minimum wage. You can see here that the same minimum wage, by staying static, actually lost its Kaitz power over time until it was modified in 1988. And you can see it dropped, goes up a little bit, drops again. And this is the pattern of behavior. Now, this is similar, but not the same as people saying wages haven't adjusted on a real thing or wages are losing ground. This is saying the minimum wage as a percentage of the median regional wage is losing its standing over time. And you can use this now to say, if you're below this 55% threshold of the mixed results, there's probably room to move it up. If you're really below, there's lots of room. If you were down here at 30%, there's a lot of room to give to move it up and not have the negative benefits exceed the positive. If you're at high, that gets into danger area. So at the far end here, what I've added in the green is this is the Sanders proposal. Senator Sanders has added this, or tried to add it to the stimulus relief bill. As some of us predicted, it failed reconciliation. Reconciliation is another topic. If you're interested, let me know. We can do a media literacy on reconciliation after I'm done with this. But it failed reconciliation, but in the stimulus relief bill, but his proposal was over the next 5 years, 21 through 2025, they were going to step up the minimum wage. And what I did is I plotted that minimum wage against the estimate of the Kaitz estimate based on the median wage. And you can see here why there's concern that $15 an hour may not work, because it jumps not just above, oh, by the way, this dashed black line, this is just the historical average. So if you average all the Kaitz results from 1980 to 2020, it comes out to about 53%. So it not only crosses the historical average, it enters that mixed transition zone and then exceeds it and gets into the danger zone. Cue Tom Cruise, Top Gun. But that's the Sanders proposal. Now, this is at the federal level. Again, it's a very broad measure. And as Laura pointed out, it's actually probably smarter to look at this at state or lower levels. So what I did here is this is actually now every single state broken out by its Kaitz level, and this is now just looking at current things. There's no history information here, it's just the current. The lower band, so at the bottom is every state. I may have missed one, but life is rough. Now I've adjusted the chart here. It goes from 25% up to 115%. And I didn't need to go down to 0% because none of them go that low, and I needed to go up to 115 because some get over 100. So you can look at any state on this chart, and you can find the lower value is where the current minimum wage is as its Kaitz value. And you can see here, things that are below this 55% threshold, they have room to move up, and most states are below this Kaitz threshold. That means there's room to move up. If you're above this red threshold, though, that means you might be getting in a danger zone. And the $15 puts a lot of them above that danger zone. So this is where and I $12 an hour and stuff like that, you could map it here. You could map anything you wanted to this state and see where it falls. And this is where those numbers are coming up: $10 an hour, $12 an hour, $15 an hour. The problem is a federal minimum wage doesn't distinguish by state. If you were to make a smart policy, right? If I was radical moderate president for the day, because radical moderates aren't kings, but if I was president for the day and I wasn't busy doing everything else I'd do when I was president for the day, I'd set a minimum wage bill that says, look, we're going to target the minimum wage at 55% of median, and it's going to be based off the regional areas that all our great folks over at the census have already determined, the MSAs, the urban areas, rural areas. Everything I use for my violence research is already well defined as to these things. Why not use those and those same economic as the population clusters and say your minimum wage is set to 55% of that regional area, and then just adjust it. Boom, done. I'm over before lunch. I got time for a round of golf. I don't even golf. I could learn. But that's what, a smart policy would be to say, hey, we know that there are no negative effects at 55% or below, or the ones that are negligible. So why don't we set the policy at 55% of median and have it self-adjusting? Now that means some areas you got a lot of room to go. Look at Georgia down here. Georgia down here is down at Sweden, by example, Georgia and Sweden example, right? The economy size of Sweden, its percentage is down at 30%. It has a lot of room to go up. You could increase the Georgia minimum wage and not have a lot of negative benefits or a lot of negative impacts. Your benefits would exceed. You'd have more people would be able to afford things. You'd have a higher wages. You'd probably have a stronger economy. But you look at one of these ones, like say, let's see, here's Delaware, I think. Delaware is already above that 55% because they have their own state. You know, California here, for example, set its state minimum wage fairly high. It's at 60%. Colorado is pretty much higher at 62%. So some of these states have higher. If they jump it up, it will exceed that red line and may cause more economic pain than the benefit. So why not use this existing science we have or this evidence we have and use this to make a smart minimum wage policy rather than have this? I mean, we can look at this, right? We only get into these debates once every 20 years. That's not a good idea. We shouldn't be, you know, when we get around to it, we should set up a policy, set it, forget it, and let it manage. But I'd suggest that when we do this, we should probably look at a policy that takes all the available evidence and says, set the minimum wage at 55% of the median regional, and then have it adjust every year thereafter. And that would make a lot more sense than this back and forth. And even without that, this is now a tool you can use. You can do these calculations yourself. Take the area you live in, find the median hourly wage for that area. It's online, it's Google, right? You can take the minimum wage. Some cities have minimum wage. Seattle has a minimum wage. Different cities have their own minimum wage, and that's not a bad idea either. Some of the economists I'm reading and preparing for this, they're describing a local city minimum wage, and that gives you that, in that fractal segmentation, that gives you the nuance and sophistication to have variable minimum wages based off those very different economies that are all tied together. Yeah, why don't they talk about this? Because I don't know, it took me 55 minutes to describe it. I don't know. This is what drives me nuts. Is like, I've known about the Kaitz index for probably about 10 years now, and I'm constantly trying to bring it out on Facebook to say, because everyone's just throwing chairs at each other and yelling. I'm like, look, you're both probably right, depending on the study and where it was in the Kaitz index. If you were looking at a study where the Kaitz index, like Puerto Rico, the Kaitz index in Puerto Rico, see, Puerto Rico is a good example. The Puerto Rico economy is so vastly different than the rest of the U.S. economy that a $7.25 minimum wage in Puerto Rico is actually punitive. It's so high, its CAT index, I think, is like 78%. And it has all these negative effects. There's a high black market labor because people can't afford the lawful minimum, so they do the black market. That, of course, loses benefits and protections. I mean, there's a lot of other stuff going on in Puerto Rico. I'm not saying this is the only thing, but there's a lot of studies of what happens when you can't control your own currency. Your regional economic situation is different, and some federal entity has a good idea from above that's going to force on you. It's no different than trying to deal with Greece and Germany in the same European Union with the single euro currency as dealing between Georgia and California. They don't need the same minimum wage, and it would probably be a bad idea to have a one-size-fits-all. Either it's too low or it's probably too high, so maybe set up a federal law that adjusts for this. Yes, Bonky is a very good golfer. Low handicap. Watch out for the hustle. That's all I got to say. The front nine, he'll make it look like he's just average, and then he'll put some money on the break. The back nine, he'll clean up, no doubt. So that's the Kaitz index and the minimum wage with the Kaitz. And if you're tuning in, again, I'm covering more basic domestic policy and things like that. If you like this kind of coverage, this is the kind of stuff I want to get into on a lot of policy topics, is really diving deep and going into the information we know and trying to get a little more context in this back and forth red versus blue. Appreciate any support that you want to give. www.patreon.com/infomullet. $5 a month to become a mulleteer. I do want to, before we end, get in some current events because it's domestic, but if you go out, share this video, comment on this video, like, follow, do all those good things. Let people know that there's this tool, the Kaitz index, and it's not an end-all be-all. I'm kind of simplifying things here, but this is important as a tool for helping people understand this policy debate on minimum wages, and you can use it in Canada too. Now the ratios are a little different. You can look up your own research, but the concept is minimum wage divided into median wage. They use it all over the world. I was looking at studies for Germany, Brazil, developing economies, mature economies. It's the same concept. The point at which the benefits, negative and positive, kind of accrue, those change a little bit. So you may want to make sure that you're looking at a study relevant to your area. But and if you like this stuff, let me know. I can do more of this policy context and providing information as opposed to just the latest scandal. Like hypothetically, I could just spend my time covering a major governor that has had nothing but bad news in the last week and just focus on that and deal with the scandal of the day. Like, let me just pick one out of the blue. Let's say we're talking, I don't know, New York, right? Let's say we wanted to pick on Governor Cuomo and say, gosh, you're a jerk. I mean, I could just do that, or I could do that at the end and save the beginning part for the policy analysis, which I'm doing here. So to talk about New York and Governor Cuomo, three things are going on. And I want to be clear here. People who have only, like, it's a common thing with the info mold that depending on what the presidential administration is, people mistake me. Under President Obama, everyone mistook me as a conservative. Under President Trump, people mistake me as a liberal. They tend to identify me with the red or blue. I'm not either. I'm a radical moderate, and I do not pick sides with either the red or the blue. And so people who are like, yeah, Trump's bad, get him. I'm like, take a look at Governor Cuomo, and that guy probably needs to be impeached, if not in jail. So here's what's going on with Cuomo. If you've been arguing about Dr. Seuss or whatever, whatever's gotten on the thing. What's going on in New York is there's three scandals that have hit simultaneously. One was a slow burn, one was a quick burn, and one is a blistering hot burn. The slow burn has to do with COVID-19, and it begins all the way back in March of last year. March 25th, Governor Cuomo issues a mandate that says, and he's out there doing the press conferences. He's the contrast with here's some important context. Governor Cuomo was contrasting himself with President Trump, who had not done anything on the pandemic. So Cuomo was wanting to look good. He's doing these daily press conferences. He's got his information together. This is important to understand for what happens next. He comes out on an edict on policy directive on March 25th that if you are an elderly patient who had COVID, you will not be barred from returning to your nursing home once you are stable. Now, looking back, it's probably not a great idea. Like what stable is and what non-infected is, and the belief that it's easy to control versus not control, probably a bad idea. But over in beginning at the end of March and April, lots of elderly went back into homes, and the death rate at the elderly nursing facilities in New York went through the roof. Now, this has been a point of contention going back into the summer even. There were allegations that this order by Cuomo, and it's not the act itself, it's always the cover-up. So let's be clear. Cuomo has the lawful authority to make that directive. We can argue whether it was good or bad. He used the information at the time. I'm not judging him on that order. But beginning in July, he starts getting questions of, did that order cause more deaths than if they'd stayed in the hospital? And he gets all sorts of bent out of shape when these questions come up in July and August, and he's mocking reporters. He's pushing them down. Well, in January 28th, the New York Attorney General is on a phone call with a bunch of Democratic officials, and she basically just goes state's evidence, right? It's a recorded line. I don't know if she knew she was recorded. She basically admits that they had been undercounting nursing home deaths in COVID by up to 50%. And she goes further and says that they knew this in August. And she says the reason they didn't bring it up in August is this context of Cuomo versus Trump. They were worried that President Trump would use bad information of how many nursing home deaths there were to open an investigation into Cuomo, punish him politically. I mean, that's entirely plausible. Like it's not. I don't think it'd be a stretch to be concerned about that. But if you're a governor of the United States, you do not have the authority to hide that information for your own political well-being. That is exactly the same kind of crap that Trump was doing, right? So Cuomo's got important information that doesn't reflect well on him. We don't care. That needs to be released. And the difference here is about 7,000 deaths. This is not a small number, right? This is more than died on 9/11, got hidden and underreported because Cuomo was concerned of what Trump would do with this information. I'm sorry, Governor Cuomo, you got a huge state, a huge budget. You're one of the largest states in the union. Cowboy your pants up and take the heat and deal with it. But he didn't. They buried it, they covered it up, and now it's come out. So this one is likely going to end up in jail time with some people, possibly Governor Cuomo himself, and possibly an impeachment. But this was the slow burn one. The mid-burn one is, as this story was developing, a representative, let me make sure I'm getting the name right here, Ron Kim. Now this is a New York assembly member for the New York Assembly, accuses Cuomo of obstructing a criminal investigation into healthcare offenses. So now we're talking about not just the crime of the cover-up, but obstructing an investigation, the crime of the cover-up of the cover-up, right? Cuomo apparently, allegedly, gets on a phone call and threatens to destroy this assemblyman. If this sounds like a past president, we only just got out of office on January 20th. It's because it is, right? We have recordings of Trump doing the exact same thing, calling up officials and basically threatening them. Governor Cuomo, now there's no tape here of this, and Governor Cuomo has disputed this. He's got witnesses said, that's not how the call went. That's going to come out in the wash. But this was the mid-burn. This has been going on. And then the blistering hot burn is really within the last week. There have been 3 credible allegations of sexual harassment by Cuomo, 2 from longtime aides that described him of making sexually inappropriate advances and harassing behavior. And there was a 3rd claim made by a woman who wasn't working for Cuomo, wasn't an aide, and just met him at a wedding. And that one has photographic evidence that corroborates not the specifics of the harassment, but the context. There's a picture of him with his hands on her face, and she looks like she's recoiling, and he looks like he's about to kiss her. So, I mean, interpret the photo as you will. There is evidence, and these women have credible stories. I think they should believe. And Cuomo's response to this was, oh, yeah, we'll have an independent investigation. I'll pick the guy, and he'll investigate this. And that lasted for about 48 hours before people said, no, I don't think so. So now the New York Attorney General, which is an independent position, they don't work for Cuomo, has basically forced Cuomo into a position where they're going to run it out of the New York Attorney Generals. They are hiring an independent law firm. That law firm will be given subpoena powers and do a full investigation. And this is how it should work, right? Somebody who is powerful is accused of something wrong. They need to be held accountable. And if the chips fall where it may, and this great Democratic governor who people thought he did really well in the pandemic, turns out he didn't do so well. He covered up on it. He intimidated people while he was covering it up, and he's a lecherous jerk to boot and harassing people. Yeah, guess what? He needs to be impeached, possibly jailed. Either one I'm fine with. I don't buy into this that we need to protect the bad apples in our group because they make good opposition to the other group. Let's find better people in our group, whatever that group is, and hold them up as the examples of what we want to be. So Cuomo is facing some tough times in the next weeks ahead, and may be out of office. Now, he's going to fight back. New York is its own political animal. There's a lot of vested interest. Some of the people coming after Cuomo, like de Blasio, the mayor of New York City, are not exactly the cleanest actors themselves. There's a lot of history between these politicians. People are getting their long knives out and sharpening them, but it's going to be interesting. But that doesn't even though New York is political, doesn't mean this should be glossed over and said, oh, that's politics. Investigate the crap out of it, find out who did wrong, and hold them accountable. Let's see if there's some questions. Cuomo is in some type of water. Yeah, I think it's hot water now. Someone saying Cuomo didn't just screw the pooch on COVID. He ran it over 4 times when he screwed the pooch in front of the encounter's family. A little graphic, but probably true. I mean, I know back in some of the videos, I was criticizing Cuomo for shutting down New York and having these restrictive travel policies and this nonsense of chasing people down and trying to track them. And certainly the super spreader event in New Jersey and New York, I mean, yes, he took it more seriously than Trump. He gets credit for that, but you still have to, someone said here, Jeremy, own your mistakes. This is August we're talking about. They knew in August that they had undercounted the deaths. That's when you come clean. You say, you know what, we screwed up, our bad. Here's how we do it. You take your lumps, you stand up, you fight back where you need to, you make the stand, you don't cover it up. Jan, gangster in New York, that'd be news. I think there's a movie about gangs in New York. I'm not sure. It sounds familiar. Valeria, ban everyone you meet. Preemptive ban. So that's the info mullet for today. Like I said, a little bit more focus without the crushing, like, what's the latest catastrophe this week? We can go a little bit more in depth on these policy issues. And if people want, I can go and all these things that are coming up, whether it's minimum wage or firearm control or Section 230, internet, all these policy things. I like discussing policies. So if you like this kind of in-depth policy discussion to equip you with the context to make better understanding and analysis, happy to do it. I hope there won't be as many crises as there are. COVID's still bad, but we'll get to that on the 3rd Wednesday. So, yeah. Everyone's shocked now. Everyone's shocked that there is gambling in this establishment. I think with power, the more power someone has, the more suspicion you need to have of them. This whole concept, this recent concept in America, and I don't remember the name of him. He's a Republican Congress critter who's in a lot of hot water because he voted to impeach Trump. But he has this phrase. He goes, politics should not be the worship of some weird dude. And that's like become my mantra, like too much, and I'm a little bit on a rant here, too much of both the blue and the red much more on the red, has become a worship of a weird dude. The celebrity status of politicians where, you know, this is my guy or gal, and I'm just gonna, everything they say, I'm gonna buy. The more power you have, the more suspicion you should have against you, the more questioning you should be getting, and the more you should be held to a higher standard than those who have less power. It doesn't sound controversial, but we're in this weird space in the US where it seems like that's now a controversial statement to say that you need to hold leaders accountable, but I think we do. And yeah, so Jeremy's asking for firearms. I'm probably going to do a segment. There's a segment on an InfoMullet called Improve Your Argument, which gets into, it doesn't say which side's right or wrong. It points out the bad arguments. The next one I'm going to probably do is firearms. So when it comes to firearms, there's a lot of really, really good arguments that can be made for or against firearm control. And then there are thousands of bad arguments that people waste hundreds of hours on debating nonsense stuff on both sides of it. So the Improve Your Argument is coming up for firearms. It's one I'm going to, it's going to basically say, look, you want to argue about these 10 things, just stop. These things are not arguable. Here's some spaces where good argument. And the point of Improve Your Argument is not to tell you what's right or wrong, but just you to get past that 500th iteration of a dumb argument, which always seems to go down the same rabbit hole, and point out, hey, there's a way to skip all that and get to a more valued, important argument or useful argument. So that will be coming out with firearms. I'll get yelled at by everyone because I'm going to burst some sacred cows for both the red and the blue about and pro firearm and anti firearm. I'm going to basically go after them with a broad hatchet. But that'll be the next InfoMullet argument on Improve Your Argument. Also coming up on InfoMullet, we have a year in review of the violence. The FBI numbers are out. Very interesting year in 2020. I made a forecast that violence would go down because of COVID, but then we had the protests over the summer and all the action, and the murder rate certainly went up. So we're going to look at the full year numbers, and I'm going to do some analysis like I've done in the past. Those are all coming out probably in the next month or so, and we'll touch on those as we get to them. So everyone, thanks very much. If you haven't, check us out on Patreon, www.patreon.com/InfoMullet. Become a Mulleteer, become a senior Mulleteer. If you are a Mulleteer or if you're a senior Mulleteer, I take your input for these topics and I give the vote to all the Mulleteers. Like if I have a choice between firearms and crossing guards, I may put it up to a vote to the Mulleteers, and we may do an in-depth study on crossing guards. But if you were a Mulleteer, you could vote for firearms, and you could vote for that being important. So if you want to have a say on what gets covered on the InfoMullet, become a Mulleteer and participate in those votes. So now that I've made the pitch, and they who must be obeyed will be happy. Everyone, please stay safe. Stay indoors if you can. If you can't, wear a mask. COVID is still out there. It's still just as bad as it was in the summer in wave 1.5. I'll go over that in the next InfoMullet a week and a half from now, 2 weeks from now. So until then, everyone, be good. Bonky and myself, take care. Bye-bye. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the InfoMullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a Mulleteer and support the InfoMullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.